The Psalms appear to give contradictory images of God in relation to sleep. Psalm 121 says that Yahweh never sleeps, that he is eternally vigilant in protecting his people from all evil. Psalm 44 gives the exact opposite picture. In that psalm, the psalmist calls upon God to wake up and save his people from the wicked who threaten to devour them. Similar images of God asleep while his people perish can be found in Psalms 7, 35, and 59. So how do we make sense of this? And for this teaching, I'm drawing on Bernard Batteau's book, In the Beginning, Essays on Creation Motifs in the Ancient Near East and the Bible. Because I had never heard of this sleeping deity motif, but it's very interesting, so I want to share that with you all, with the audience here. So this video is going to be me going through Bernard Batteau's article from that book. So how do we make sense of this seeming contradiction? And scholars have varying approaches to deal with this. Some suggest anthropomorphism or metaphor, and these are among the more popular examples. But when we place this sleeping deity motif within its ancient Near Eastern context, a different story emerges. In this ancient Near Eastern context, the sleeping deity is associated with his role as supreme creator, and sleeping or resting is a symbol of his divine rule. He has the right and authority to rest and sleep because he is the supreme God. And widespread in the history of religions is this motif of the leisure or sleep of the creator God. And there are multiple examples from Egyptian and Mesopotamian texts that promote this idea, and they put forward this emphasis that the proper posture for the most powerful deity, the supreme deity, is to be at ease or resting or sleeping. So that's one of the ways that the sleeping deity motif is associated with the supreme creator. It's also a symbol of the divine rule. So divine rest or leisure was closely connected with the second theme, which is the divine authority, as a symbol of divine authority. The ability of the divine king to sleep undisturbed was a symbol of his unchallenged authority as the supreme deity. So it's both the idea of the supreme creator and the supreme sovereign, because he can rest. So, and a corollary concept was also present, that to interrupt or disturb the sleep of the supreme deity was tantamount to rebellion against his dominion. So the rebels would wake up the sleeping, the most powerful, the supreme deity. They would wake him up, but this was tantamount to rebellion. We see this in the Mesopotamian Atrahasis myth, when the lesser gods revolted against the divine king while he was asleep. So when he woke up, it did not go well for the rebels in that Mesopotamian myth. So we also see that kingship and sleep are linked concepts, and this is common within the Chaos Kampf mythologies of the ancient world, in which the gods battle for supremacy, and after the battle, there will be sleep or rest involved, depending on who's victorious. So in the Ugaritic version of this Chaos Kampf myth, it's only after Baal defeats Mot that El can rest. And in the Babylonian version, Marduk rests after slaying Tiamat. And it's only after the monster of chaos has been transformed into an ordered and inhabitable cosmos that the deity can enjoy absolute rest. So that's what happened in the Babylonian version of the myth, that Marduk slayed Tiamat, who was the chaos monster, the chaos dragon, and then from her body he used part of it to create the earth and part of it to create the sky or heaven. And then after he did that, he could rest. And it's only after this that Marduk could rest and enjoy undisturbed sleep. So there's another point of view, though, that sees this battle against chaos as a perpetual struggle. And the human experience certainly taught taught and teaches just how fragile the order in the world is. So the conception of this perpetual struggle was certainly present also in the Egyptian text known as the repulsing of the dragon, in which each day the sun god Ra arose out of the primeval ocean Nun to repulse anew Apophis, who was the Egyptian version of this dragon, this chaos dragon. And then by so doing, Ra would dispel the darkness and chaos from the world, but he had to do this every day. So this is also present in the Mesopotamian version, where they would have, I believe it was an annual ritual that would kind of reenact some of this or remember this or to remind Marduk kind of the idea that, hey, the chaos is still, it rises every so often. It's not a done deal, but it's a perpetual struggle, and the peace is fragile, so to speak. So that's kind of how the pagan world viewed it. So just to briefly go over this idea again. So the ancient Near Eastern usage of the sleeping deity motif, it was often bound together with that of divine rest or leisure. And this stemmed from the notion that it was proper for gods to enjoy leisure. This theme was conjoined to creation in two ways. One, suggesting that the purpose of creation was to afford the gods their restful sleep, their right to rest, and the other suggests that the Creator himself enjoyed rest upon creation, the completion of his work. And further, the explicit portrayal of the Creator sleeping functioned as a statement of the deity's status as the supreme ruler of heaven and earth. The ability to sleep undisturbed was the symbol of the deity's absolute dominion over the heavens and the earth and the underworld. The most vivid image of this dominion was that of the Creator King subduing the chaos monster and then retiring to his chamber to sleep peacefully without fear of interruption. And these motifs are also present in the biblical narrative. We may not notice it when reading Genesis, but it lies behind the text. Because while it's true that chaos is presented less as a personal foe than as the raw material that God used or organized in causing the ordered cosmos to appear, the theme of the divine king resting in his newly built temple palace after his victory over the monster of chaos seems to be present also. Now that's a disputed point, a debated point amongst the scholars. I myself do think that it is present behind the text of Genesis, but that's not universally held. Because some scholars believe that Tehom in Genesis 1:1 is the Hebrew equivalent of Tiamat. Now that is also that's a less held position now than it was in decades past. It used to be the case that a lot of scholars did look at Genesis 1:1, saw Tehom there, and believed that it was the Hebrew equivalent of Tiamat from the Babylonian Chaos Kampf. But I think today it's more common to view the similarities more with the Ugaritic rather than the Babylonian Chaos Kampf texts. So the Net scholars have a note about this, and they say, quote, "In the Babylonian account of creation, Marduk killed the goddess Tiamat and used her carcass to create heaven and earth. The form of the Hebrew word for deep is distinct enough from the name Tiamat to deny direct borrowing. However, it is possible that there is a polemical stress here," end quote. So that's a little bit on Genesis 1, but there are other passages that have this Chaos Kampf much more clearly described, and we will get into what does this have to do with the divine sleep motif from the ancient Near Eastern world. So we are getting to that. So Psalm 74, verse 13 and 14 says, and the psalmist speaking to God, to Yahweh, he says, "You divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the dragons in the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan and let the desert animals eat him." So there's clearly a battle there between God and Leviathan. Job 7 verse 12 says, Job's asking God, "Am I a sea monster or a dragon that you must place me under guard?" So that would go back again to Genesis, where God has the or potentially back to Genesis, where if you do see this chaos conf behind the text of Genesis, the tehom is also it's subdued before Yahweh begins the creation or recreation, depending on if you hold to the gap theory. So Job is asking, am I a sea monster or a dragon that you place me under guard like you did these other dragons before? Job 9:13 says, God won't retract his anger. The helpers of Rahab bow beneath him. And Rahab is the name of a mythical sea monster that represents chaos in ancient literature. So we see the idea there, again, that those who helped Rahab in this ancient chaos fight bow or submit to God in Job 9. Job 26:12 says, by his power he stills the sea. By his wisdom he cut Rahab, the great sea monster, to pieces. So if these passages do in fact inform us of what went on in primeval generations, and I do think so. I do hold to the gap theory myself, that before Genesis 1:1, there was a creation and then a judgment when the original rebellion of the first members of the divine council that rebelled, Satan and whoever all else was with him, that led to a judgment by God. And so we see some of that. I tend to believe we see some of that idea here in Job and some of the Psalms, and then God recreates in Genesis 1:1 after that original rebellion. But of course, that is a highly disputed position and is, I think, not as widely held now as it used to be. But if these passages do in fact inform us of that, then it would also give a greater insight into Yahweh's words in Exodus 20 verse 11, when it says, for in 6 days Yahweh made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and everything in them, but on the seventh day he rested. So if there was this idea of a battle prior, then it would fit well with and conform to the ancient Near Eastern motifs of the supreme deity battling the rebellious members. In this case, it would be Yahweh battling. And we have to be careful here, because it's not like there's actually any kind of actual battle. It's not like Yahweh might lose or anything like that, but it's communicating this idea that when these rebels rose up against him, he put them down quickly and easily. He didn't need any help. In the Ugaritic version, Baal needs help from the other gods. I can't remember in the Babylonian version, but I think Marduk needs help as well. I'm almost positive he does. But there's nowhere in the scripture where Yahweh needs help in putting down these rebellious members of the council. The Leviathan, the chaos monster, any of these rebels, Yahweh puts them down by himself and with ease, and they are already put down and subdued by the time we even get to the book of Genesis. So I don't want it to sound like I'm suggesting that Yahweh struggles in any kind of sense to deal with the chaos. He does not. As we'll see as we continue, he subdues it with his word, by speaking. But the ideas, again, do conform potentially to this ancient Near Eastern motif of the supreme God resting after he has vanquished those who rebel against him and has created heaven and earth. But it is true that nowhere in the Bible do we find an actual description of God retiring to sleep after his battle with the chaos monster. But it suggests that the image is presupposed in several passages. And one of the most illuminating of such passages is Isaiah 51. So I'm going to read part of that. I'm going to read verse 9 through 11, and I'm going to read the translation that Bato himself does for that passage. And it says, "Awake, awake, robe yourself in power, O arm of Yahweh. Awake as in primordial days, primeval generations. Is it not you who cleaves Rahab in pieces, who pierces the sea dragon? Is it not you who dries up the sea, the waters of the great abyss? the one who makes the depths of the sea a road for the redeemed to pass over. So I want to point out that in the previous line, the waters of the great abyss, that is the Hebrew tehom again. So same word from Genesis 1:1. So both the image of the battle against the chaos monster and the image of the divine victor retiring to sleep lie behind this appeal for help, because he's calling upon Yahweh to awake, awake, awake. So the reason you would call on someone to awake is if they're sleeping. So again, this idea lies behind this passage in Isaiah 51. At least that's Bato's suggestion. I think it makes good sense myself also. So we see that God's salvific power, his saving power, was most manifest in his victory over the chaos monster at the creation of the world. If you, again, hold to this idea that Bato is suggesting and that I also myself hold to. And it's also, God's salvific power is also evident in his splitting of the sea in order to allow his people to escape from Egypt. This is not a case of myth in one instance and history in the other. And then, so Bato, he holds, so I'm just going to mention this, Bato holds to the Deutero-Isaiah, which is the common predominant view in scholarship. I myself don't hold to Deutero-Isaiah, but Bato does. And so he links the Isaiah 51, he believes that it's written later by the second Isaiah during the exilic period. So I don't myself hold to that, but I'm going to just, for the sake of this discussion, I'm just going to grant that because Bato uses that to put forward some other ideas that I think are interesting. So he says that Deutero-Isaiah, or we could just say, I would just say Isaiah, understood these two, God's victory over the chaos monster at the creation and his victory over the sea, splitting the sea, that Bato is suggesting that Isaiah understood these two as essentially one and the same act of salvation. That Egypt was viewed in the historical sense as a type of chaos. They were a manifestation. Egypt was a manifestation of the power of chaos. We see this same idea in Ezekiel 29, where Pharaoh is called a dragon, which also links to the Gog and Magog. I did a video on that, a number of videos on that. So while the Exodus was seen as an extension of God's creative power, just as God split the primeval sea to create dry land, so he split the sea again during the Exodus to create a special people for himself, to bring them out. And as we discussed in, I believe it was our series on Jonah, how Egypt was also portrayed as the underworld, how you would go down to Egypt and then come out of Egypt. It was used to communicate the idea of descending into Sheol. And so when God told Jacob that he would go down to Egypt and bring him out again, that was a way of communicating in a symbolic, perhaps typological sense, that God would go with his people into the underworld and then bring them out again. It was a prophecy of the death and resurrection of Jesus in the book of Genesis there. I lost my place. Let me get back to where I was here. So he split the primeval sea in Genesis. He split the same typological thing in the Exodus, and he brought his people out of the underworld, which was symbolized by Egypt. The underworld is also the place of chaos. It's also worth noting that according to Exodus 15, it's Yahweh's mighty arm or outstretched hand that brought the victory during the Exodus. So the same thing in Isaiah 59, where he's talking about the arm. He says, "Robe yourself in power, or O arm of Yahweh." It was the same arm of Yahweh that was credited with the victory over the sea in Exodus 15. So we see the dependence of Isaiah 51, 9 through 11 on this idea of the chaos conf. We see it evident there. So not only is the victory over the chaos monster attributed to Yahweh, but it is even implied that he retired afterwards to his private chamber to sleep, as in the traditional ancient Near Eastern story. So again, why would I say that? Because Isaiah is calling on him to awake. So he subdued the chaos monster, and then he, again, according to this motif, he went to sleep, and so Isaiah is calling upon him to awaken. And the reason that he's calling upon Yahweh to awaken is because he's viewing chaos as rising once again. That according to the prophecy there, depending again if you believe in Deutero-Isaiah, you wouldn't believe it's prophecy, but since I hold to the one Isaiah, he's calling on the Lord, he's calling on Yahweh to wake up because the chaos is rising again. And it's like he's saying, wake up just like and robe yourself in strength as you did when you fought the chaos before, because the chaos is rising again to challenge to challenge your dominion. But it's interesting how Yahweh responds in verse 15 of Isaiah 51. It's a similar response that we see in Jeremiah 31:35. And it's Yahweh's response is to assure his people that he is in control of the chaos, even if it doesn't seem so. And then if you continue reading Isaiah 51, Yahweh turns the summons around on the people, and he says in verse 17, wake up, get up, O Jerusalem. So I find that very interesting. It's as if Yahweh is saying, I'm not sleeping. Your sins have put you to sleep spiritually and allowed chaos to rise. So we see, and we just know, our own sins and our own apathy can put us to sleep spiritually and allow chaos to rise. So, we call on God to help us, and then God, would call on us, you need to wake up and repent. So we see it's very interesting how this wake up is used throughout Isaiah 51. Another passage that calls upon the Lord to awake or wake up is Psalm 44. So 44:23, it says, wake up, O Lord, why do you sleep? Get up, don't reject us forever. So there's a similarity between Psalm 44 and Isaiah 51, 9 through 11. In that psalm, the psalmist appeals to the strong arm of God to act, as in the days of old, both at the Exodus and at creation. And this reference to creation is particularly instructive, for it explicitly links God's eternal kingship with his victory over the mythical chaos monster, verse 13 and 14. And the creation of the cosmos in verse 15 to 17. Which is the traditional context of the sleeping deity motif. And it comes as no surprise then when we see the psalmist call upon God to get up or wake up and do something about the enemy who scoffs at him and his people. Because in that context, at least Bato believes that Psalm 44 was written in the context of the Babylonian invasion. And so he says that the Babylonians there are representative of the primeval chaos. So as we saw, the Egyptians representing the chaos monster, and that's clear. We also see the Babylonians, which is also clear when you look at the book of Jeremiah, where Nebuchadnezzar is also called a dragon. So whether or not, I'm sure it's debated. I haven't looked at scholarship on Psalm 44. I'm just going through this article by Bato here, but I'm sure that it's debated as to the context of Psalm 44 and whether it does or doesn't have to do with the Babylonians. But the idea of the Babylonians being representations of chaos and the dragon is clear from Jeremiah. So Psalm 7, 35, and 59 also contain this sleeping deity theme and motif, as I believe I mentioned at the start. And Bato's suggestion is that behind each of these psalms, there are vestiges of the ancient Near Eastern motif of the sleeping deity. And the portrayal of Yahweh as asleep was a culturally conditioned theological statement to the effect that Yahweh is the creator and absolute king of heaven and earth. So that's important to point out. Because when we think of sleeping, we think of God sleeping, we would default to thinking that he is unaware and he is not all-powerful, and it would be to call on God to wake up would, at least to me, before I guess thought of this, it would, or before I was aware of how Bato is presenting this in this ancient Near Eastern motif, that it would be the call on God to wake up. I guess I was taking it differently than how Bato is saying that the Israelites would have understood it. So let me just continue here rather than me trying to stumble through, I guess, how I would have read it. We'll just see how Bato suggests that the ancient Israelites would have read it. So, again, he's saying that the portrayal of Yahweh as asleep was a theological statement to the effect that Yahweh is creator and absolute king of heaven and earth. See, that's not what I would have gotten when I think of God sleeping. But again, I'm not in that culture. So to them, Yahweh as sleeping was because he is the absolute king of heaven and earth and the creator. So when they appeal to Yahweh to wake up, it is not a slur on the effectiveness of divine rule. And I guess that's how I would have thought what they meant was when they're calling him to wake up, kind of you're not really doing the job. But that's not what they would have thought or what they would have meant when they call upon him to wake up. So far from being a slur on the effectiveness of Yahweh's rule, the call upon him to awaken was actually an extension of Israel's active faith in Yahweh's universal rule, even in the midst of gross injustice and manifest evil. As the chaos rises, they call upon Yahweh to wake up because they believe and they have faith that he is the universal sovereign, that he does have universal rule. So that brings us then to Psalm 121, where the inverse of this motif is in play. Because in Psalm 121, we see that Yahweh never slumbers or sleeps. So this idea functions as in the same way, which is interesting. So the idea of Yahweh never sleeping functions in the same way as the call upon him to wake up. And I just would never have thought that that would have been the case. So again, at the beginning I suggested, is this a contradiction? Well, to them it isn't. The idea is actually the same thing. So when they say that Yahweh never sleeps, or they call upon him to wake up, they're expressing the same idea. And it's a function of their expression of faith in Yahweh as creator and absolute sovereign. So the one of faith walks in confidence that his or her world would not collapse because the keeper of Israel, Yahweh, is eternally vigilant in maintaining the order which he has divinely ordained. So when Psalm 121 is saying Yahweh never sleeps, and then we see in Isaiah and these other Psalms are calling upon him to wake up, it's actually communicating the same idea. It's like we have faith that you are sovereign, that you are God, that you care about us, and we know that you're watching over us, and you're not going to allow everything to collapse, even though things seem difficult and dark at the moment. So I think that's very interesting. That I guess in a kind of a funny say, whether or not they portray Yahweh as having insomnia or whether they need to wake him up, it's the same idea, and it's an example of how they show their faith. That God, you are in control and you have the power over the situation, and you can. We're asking you to act on our behalf. So it's very interesting. And the idea of battling the chaos monster reaches its final crescendo at the eschaton. In Isaiah 27 verse 1, it says, "On that day Yahweh will take a great sword, harsh and mighty, and will punish Leviathan the fleeing serpent, Leviathan the writhing serpent, and will kill the dragon that is in the sea." So at the end times, the chaos will be put down for the final time. And that's what some scholars believe is being communicated in the book of Revelation when it says there will be no more sea, because that's communicating the ancient concept of the sea as the chaos, the place of chaos. And so when Yahweh when he deals with it the final time, it'll never rise again. So that's the Old Testament idea of the sleeping deity motif. And I think that's all, personally I find that to be very interesting, but it actually gets even better. Because with that background, we can now set the stage for the final biblical adaptation of this motif of the sleeping deity when we get to the New Testament story of Jesus when he deals with the sea. So in the New Testament, Jesus both walks upon the sea and he calms the storm. So with this background of the sleeping deity motif, if we link this with the Gospels, we would see the evangelists attach special significance to these points in time when Jesus dealt with the sea, and they use these I want to say stories, but that might imply that they didn't happen. They use these historical these pieces of history, these things that actually happened. They use them with this ancient motif of the sleeping deity to reveal who Jesus is, who they believe that he is. So from the manner in which the evangelists shape these two stories using traditional biblical language and the images of divine activity, it is evident that they regarded both stories as manifesting the divine presence. So to them, Jesus, in the way that he deals with the sea, it reveals that he is God. And again, this would be something that we perhaps might not know or notice reading from a Western cultural mindset. But in the Old Testament, as we've just been discussing for about a half an hour now, the power both to still the raging sea and to trample upon the back of the sea belongs to God alone. Now, we didn't really discuss the God trampling upon the back of the sea, but that is also in the Old Testament. Job 9, Habakkuk chapter 3, specifically in the Septuagint, and Psalm 77 has this idea. And both of these, both God stilling the raging sea and walking upon the sea, derive ultimately from his victory over the primeval sea. So accordingly, it is not accidental that Jesus walking upon the sea is described in the language of Yahweh's walking or trampling on the back of the sea. Specifically, the Septuagint of Job chapter 9, verse 8, it talks about God as the one who walks on the sea as if on ground. Again, that's the Septuagint of Job 9, 8. So similarly, Jesus' calming of the sea borrows upon the terminology of Yahweh's stilling of the hostile sea, especially when this stilling is done through the divine rebuke. And you can see that in the Septuagint of Job 16:11. So in these instances, the evangelists use the theophonic connotations of this language to suggest that Jesus possessed divine power. And the matter of Jesus sleeping on the storming sea must be interpreted within this context. And previous commentators, when trying to deal with this question of why was Jesus sleeping, it seems that they failed to appreciate the full significance intended by the evangelists. And multiple theories have been suggested to explain why Jesus was sleeping, and I think it's interesting, and I want to go through a few of these. Because before I was aware of this idea of the sleeping deity, I would have not understood the significance of why Jesus was sleeping either. So some take Jesus' sleep as an indication of his humanness, that he was fatigued by the demands of the crowd, and he was seeking refuge in the boat where he promptly fell asleep. And then some link that, and he was like just oblivious to what was going on around him. He was so exhausted that he just went and more or less passed out. Bato fully rejects that one. He says that those people who believe that have missed the point totally. There's another view that's closer but still misses the ultimate impact. They interpret Jesus' ability to sleep undisturbed during the storm as a sign that he had faith and trusted in the protective power of God. But it's not the faith of Jesus that is the point of the narrative, but it's the faith of the disciples that's on trial. The third view I'll just briefly mention here is that some link Jesus calming the storm and Jonah chapter 1. Now, while that is interesting for sure, the sleeping of Jesus cannot be adequately explained by linking it to Jonah being asleep, because both the motive and the result of sleep are different in the two stories. Jesus is not sleeping the same way that Jonah is sleeping. Jesus' disciples do not awaken him to intercede with God as what happens in Jonah when Jonah is awoke and told to pray. But the disciples call upon Jesus as the distressed sailors call upon Yahweh in Psalm 107 to save them from the storm. So while I'm definitely a big fan of, and I've done multiple teachings about Jesus using the sign of Jonah for himself, it's Jesus here, it's being asleep during the storm. Jesus is not here cast as the Jonah figure. He's not typological of Jonah in this particular instance, but Jesus here is the Yahweh figure. He is the one that's called upon to save from the storm. Lord of the storm. He's Lord of the storm. And since this is the only passage in the New Testament in which we read of Jesus sleeping, it appears that the evangelists attached special significance to it. I think they definitely did. And this is most obvious in Mark, because Mark personified the sea and identified it with the demonic. Accordingly, the sea is rebuked, and the net scholars in this section, they say that the word that Mark uses carries the implication of a threat. So Jesus is rebuking and threatening the storm in almost identical terms as he rebuked and threatened the demon in Mark 1:25. So that's why Bato is pointing to Mark as the most obvious example of this idea of Jesus rebuking the storm as though it were a chaos monster, because the language Mark uses is the way that is also used for when Jesus casts out demons. And even the reaction of the bystanders is similar in Mark 1 and when Jesus calms the storm. So the sea is an extension of the demonic, and this is evident also in the following incident of the possessed man in the land of the Gerasenes. So after Jesus rebukes the storm, very similar to the way he rebukes demons, he goes and encounters the man possessed by legion. And when Jesus cast the legion of demons out of the man, these entered the swine and rushed headlong over the cliff into the sea. And Bato suggests that was appropriate because they went to their rightful home, because the sea was considered to be the source of evil. Again, the sea as the chaos. So Mark here, the suggestion is that Mark was drawing upon the long biblical tradition of the Creator's battle with the chaos monster, though the latter is reinterpreted more specifically as the diabolical kingdom of Satan and his cohorts. So again, Jesus is in the Yahweh role, rebuking the sea and casting out the demonic, or the chaos monsters. And indeed, a major theme in Mark is the conflict between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of evil, and it's a battle to the death. And interestingly, this idea of the battle to the death, Jesus died, of course, but that was how he won. That was his victory, the Christus victor. He won by dying. And by dying, he swallowed up death forever. And that brings to mind Isaiah 25, verse 7 and 8, where it says, "He will swallow up on this mountain the veil that is veiling all peoples, the shroud enshrouding all nations. He will swallow up death forever. Yahweh God will wipe tears from every face. He will remove his people's disgrace from off the whole earth, for Yahweh has spoken." So this battle between God and evil, between God and death, between God and the powers of chaos, however you want to put it, Isaiah 25, it's a great passage that Yahweh will swallow up death forever. And when Christ died and rose, he defeated death. So just to conclude here, just as the Israelites had called upon Yahweh to awaken and save them in their tribulation, so Jesus' disciples call upon him to wake up and help them against the sea, which was threatening to swallow them. So, again, the chaos is threatening to swallow the disciples, and they call upon God to intervene, and Jesus does, in fact, get up and intervene. And just like Yahweh, Jesus arises. He rebukes the raging sea, the demonic sea. So, the image of Jesus sleeping is modeled after that of the sleeping divine king. His sleeping indicates not powerlessness, but the possession of absolute authority. So I just found that to be fascinating. I didn't know a lot of that symbolism and background, and so when I came across that in Bato's article, here again in the book, it's titled In the Beginning, Essays on Creation Motifs in the Ancient Near East and the Bible. I just wanted to share that with everybody. Hope you found it as interesting as I did. God bless, and I'll talk to you all very soon.